welcome again to 10 Things About Writing. Today I'm going to talk about openings, and particularly openings in short fiction, because here the way you begin a story is often critical because people have a shorter attention span when it comes to short fiction, and it's very easy just to flip to the next story if you don't like the way a story opens. And I'm particularly guilty of this, and I don't really feel all that guilty about it because honestly, if a short story hasn't hooked you by the end of the first paragraph, or at least got you to ask a question that you want to know the answer of, then, it's probably a mediocre short story. And time is limited, and so is fiction. And I'm going to use again a book that I've used before because it's extremely good at giving me examples of things which, in my opinion, don't work terribly well. I'm not going to tell you who the authors are, but this is a published book that's presumably had an editor and has gone through the whole process of publishing, and therefore it's fair game as far as I can see, and you can learn a lot from things that are not particularly well written, and you can use them to help hone your own craft. Now, short stories should start with something that makes you ask a question, engages you with a character, engages you with a place, and particularly doesn't put you off or give you the impression that you're going to get something of a bumpy ride. The one I'm going to start with is a horror story, or at least a story of suspense. And I will stop at the point at which I would, as a reader, probably have stopped. The loneliest place to be, Wendy said, is forgotten. She toyed with a strand of yellow hair so fine it looked like it had been printed on paper and then the paper thrown away. Okay, this is where I stopped. That's not quite true. I did actually read the whole of the story, but it didn't get any better, and I'm going to tell you why. For a start, we talked about physicality in another of these sessions, and I said at the time that you have to be very careful when writing the physicality of characters, because sometimes it's easy to be carried away with an image that really doesn't make sense. Now, there are two sentences here at the beginning that I've read you, and neither of them make sense to me. And that has suspended my suspension of disbelief. I have lost interest in the story. I've already moved on. The loneliest place to be, Wendy said, is forgotten. Well, forgotten isn't a place. It's not even got a capital letter here to suggest that it might be a place. It's just a really bad metaphor. As for the strand of yellow hair that looked as if it had been printed on paper and then thrown away, I just lost the will to live after this sentence. What's it supposed to convey? Is it supposed to be funny? The story does have elements of humour, but what it made me want is to just throw the story away, which is not a great way to engage a reader. I appreciate that sometimes engaging the reader is a bit hit and miss anyway. I mean, you may long to read more of this story. And as you write, obviously, it's something to bear in mind that not everybody has the same taste. Not everybody will be engaged with the same kind of thing, but it's important, if you are wanting to pull your reader in, for you to pull out all the stops and not to give them anything which is going to give them pause for thought in a bad way. I'm going to give you as an alternative this piece of writing by Dorothy Parker from a short story called The Sexes. And it is again an introduction of a character, and I think all of these examples I'm going to give you today are in some way introductions of characters, because obviously in a story you have to introduce your characters early, but you also have to do it in a way that tells you something about the character as opposed to about what the author is thinking at the time. The young man with the scenic cravat glanced nervously down the sofa at the girl in the fringed dress. She was examining her handkerchief. It might have been the first one of its kind she had seen, so deep was her interest in its material, form, and possibilities. The young man cleared his throat without necessity or success, producing a small, syncopated noise. Okay, well, I can tell already that this is supposed to be humour. It is Dorothy Parker humour, which you may or may not find funny, but it is a nicely constructed opening paragraph, whether you're into this kind of thing or not. It's easy to read aloud. It has the right kind of rhythms and structure in the sentences that makes it easy to articulate. And this is an important thing when you're reading, even if you're only reading to yourself. If when you read something aloud, it doesn't quite ring true, or if it's difficult, or if it makes you hesitate, then there is something wrong in that sentence, whether or not the author or the author's editor is aware of it. It could have been fixed. The kind of humour that we have here is very gentle, and it is of a certain kind. But it's not just a paragraph about being funny. It's not just about taking an image and going, I'm going to tell you something clever which is going to make you smile. No, there is a little more than that, because each line is a judgment on the character. The young man with the scenic cravat, we already know what a scenic cravat looks like. I'm not quite sure how to picture it, but either way, there is something slightly pretentious about this young man's clothing. We know what kind of a young man he is supposed to be. He's trying hard. The girl in the fringed dress, this examination of her handkerchief. Again, we know something about her. We know that there is a shyness in her, a tension, that there is a tension between them. The young man clearing his throat. We know that he's building up to something. By the end of this paragraph, which is very short, the reader should already be asking questions. Like, what exactly are they up to? We kind of want to know what's going to happen next. And it's been done in a very, very short form. I'm going to tell you another story, or at least the beginning of another story, which I would probably not have read further at. And this one is again from the same golden collection of short stories that I've been using in the past couple of seminars. This again is the beginning of the story. It's supposed to pull you in. Me reading it aloud will probably show you why it didn't pull me in. Carl loved the freedom of the BMW R1200 GS. Had for the last 2 months he'd been touring, but today more than ever. He'd just spotted the rabbit or mole or whatever the hell that furry thing was darting across the A299. Hit the gas, great torque. Big tyre at the back of the bike, anti-locking discs in the front, meant he could swerve and speed at the same time in this weather and miss the thing, instead of having it squashed beneath his wheels. The R1200 was a major bike, and he could have done with £460 instead of 560. Or, okay, I've lost the will to read further on this. There are too many numbers in here. What the fuck? Why are there so many numbers in this paragraph, and what are they supposed to tell the reader? I'm not quite sure why they've been included or why there is so much about this bike. Okay, full disclosure, I don't know anything about bikes. Somebody who really loves bikes may have actually been pulled in by this story, in which case, read on with my blessing. But it has put me off as an ordinary reader who was expecting a story, and a story of suspense, rather than a bike manual. So, in this paragraph, regardless of whether you're desperate for more bike action, I don't know anything about Carl, except that he seems to love numbers and he loves bikes, and there was some kind of animal, he doesn't know what it was, and he may or may not have run it over. I couldn't care less about any of this stuff. I don't care about Carl or how much he weighs or how much his bike weighs. I also found it very difficult to read aloud, as you probably figured out, because it's full of these numbers and they don't give anything. They don't make me ask a question. They don't make me want to turn the page, and so I'm not going to. I'm going to toss it, because that is what I do with stuff that puts me off. And I'm going to read you something from Shirley Jackson, who you know that I love. Again, full disclosure, I think she's a great writer, but she is also great at quietly engaging. And this is the start of a story called The Sorcerer's Apprentice. And again, it's the introduction of a character. There is one number in there. Miss Matt was at least partially conscious that she looked like the teacher everyone has had for English in first-year high school. She was small and pretty, in a rice powder fashion, with a great mass of soft dark hair that tried to stay on top of her head and straggled instead down over her ears. Her voice was low and turned pleading instead of sharp. Any presentable 14-year-old bully could pass her course easily. She had read Silas Marner aloud almost daily for the past 10 years. mark tests in a dainty blue pencil, and still blushed dreadfully at the age of 34. Okay, this is nothing but character description. And yet, the author has done something. She has done several things. She's described the character physically. This isn't always the thing to do at the beginning of a short story, because sometimes it can make people zone out. But she's also suggested other things. She has suggested a vulnerability. She has suggested, this voice that turns pleading, this idea that she's easily bullied, the fact that she blushes, even though she is the grand old age of 34. There is something about her, something vulnerable, that suggests that something, this being Shirley Jackson, is going to happen to her. I would argue that the questions have been asked, at least enough for me to continue finishing at least to the end of the page, and maybe to the end of the whole story. Because instead of just giving physical description, we have been given, quite cleverly, a little insight into the character. There isn't too much descriptive talk, there aren't too many details, but we've been given a snapshot, we've been given an invitation to dance. I am still with the author. My third example of something that I probably wouldn't have continued with is, again, it's a story of suspense. I've chosen it because actually the style is not dissimilar to the vintage of Dorothy Parker or Shirley Jackson. It's just that it hasn't been handled as well. And here's why. I do not think of myself as a fussy man. Nobody could accuse me of being a hothouse flower. We looked at David with frank admiration. He is a large man, built on a scale suggestive of Edwardian municipal banquets, and assuming a style vaguely reminiscent of that period. His torso is expansive, his abdomen even more so. He might just conceivably be viewed as a hothouse flower, but it would have been one of those gigantic exotic blooms whose petals looked worryingly like animal tissue. On the other hand, he most definitely is a fussy man. He frequently does, quell a room full of aggravating students or stare down a burglar, and he's done that too, but that's another story, and even he would admit that the polychrome glory of his dressing gown may have played its part in undermining the man's spirit. Okay, my spirit has now been undermined, because it goes on for some time at this pace and along these lines, and I think it's too much. I think the author has tried to be a bit too clever for a bit too long and has not delivered enough by this time, and it's nearly the end of the first page, to really interest me in this man, whether he's a hothouse flower or not. There's nothing particularly wrong with the style. It's not, it's not stupid. There isn't anything that jars visually, although the gigantic blooms whose petals look worryingly like animal tissue sound a bit odd here, because it seems to me that the rest of the paragraph is at least gently humorous. I think we could have stopped at the end of the second phrase, where basically David is a large man built on a scale suggestive of Edwardian municipal banquets. Not easy to say aloud, but still, I would have been okay with that, and then on with the story. But so much description of him and his torso, and his polychrome glory, and his dressing gowns. And you know what? I don't know this guy yet. I don't know enough to care quite so much about his wardrobe and the bits of his body which are getting so much description. This is a short story. It's not short enough for me. I bailed. So shoot me. I'm not untypical in this. Readers do it all the time. The more you read, the more you will do it. You may feel a little guilty at first. Afterwards, you'll feel relieved, because life is short, books are long, and sometimes they feel even longer. I'm going to read you one last one from Shirley Jackson. Next time, I promise I'll find somebody other than Shirley Jackson, but I do like her. And this is the introduction, again, of a story of suspense, a gentle story of suspense, because her stories often are, called All She Said Was Yes. What can you do? Howard and Dorry are always telling me I'm too sensitive and let myself get worked up about things. But really, even Howard had to admit that the Lansons' accident just couldn't have happened at a worse time. It sounds awful when you come right out and say it, but I'd always rather be frank and open than mealy-mouthed. And even though it was a dreadful thing to happen any time, it really made me furious to have our trip to Maine ruined. Short paragraph, but it delivers a lot. It delivers plenty of characterization. We know that the narrator of this person is petty and selfish, and although something awful has happened to a couple that seem to be her friends, the thing that she really worries about is that her holiday was ruined. We already know who we're rooting for in this story, and questions have already been asked. What was this horrible accident? How could it possibly have happened that it ruined her trip to Maine? We are engaged, or at least I would agree that I would be engaged, and I am likely to read further. I hope this gives you some sort of idea on how quickly and how efficiently a reader can be either yanked into a story or propelled out of it. Next time I'll start about the beginnings of novels, which is a slightly different topic, but again related and worth looking at. Till then, all the best, happy writing, and goodbye.